It's either a tension of we're going to try to forestall the innovation we don't know that's coming with the regulation, as we've mentioned already, or it's are they also investing in whatever they think's next that we've got to move? We're eventually going to have to move to.
Well, and this goes to the idea of like the mergers and acquisitions. So we're getting kind of more into the antitrust realm now, which is once again both the left and the right are calling for break up big tech, stop them from being able to acquire other companies, stop them from being able to do mergers. So one of the proposals that's out there is if you're a big tech platform over a certain size, you shouldn't be allowed to acquire or merge at all. Like your company, what it is right now, that's it. And it's like, well, the way that companies like Apple and Google and Microsoft are able to stay relevant is because they're constantly branching out into new industries and trying to find new niches. Because, for example, at one point in time, Microsoft, had the dominant internet browser in all of the world, Internet Explorer. Well, they just retired it.
Yeah.
They have a replacement for Edge now, which some people use.
iTunes is gone now.
iTunes is gone now. And it's their ability. I mean, these large companies, people love them or hate them, but they are also sort of capital firms themselves for the research and development that creates the new technologies that we'll be using in the future. And that might not be enough to keep all of these companies in business perpetually, but it is the only way that they stay in business, because the original product that they got known for is not necessarily going to be the thing that it was profitable 20 years from now. Look at Apple. What percentage of its profits are made from selling Macintosh computers anymore?
Right.
They almost went under.
Right?
I remember the old clunker Apple with the rainbow Apple way back in the 90s.
Yeah.
It was like, this is the crap computer. Give me a Gateway.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we studied this thing in grad school called X inefficiency, where companies, as they get larger, start to introduce more inefficiencies in their operating model because communication and coordination becomes more difficult with a larger organism. And no one really understands it that well or why it's that way, but it seems to be the case that people have this idea that these giant companies are these unstoppable juggernauts, but actually you start to get really inefficient when you have giant companies because nothing talks to each other very well. And that's why you see over and over again these little lean startups come and just knock down these old incumbents, because they have a vision and they have 5 people on staff and they get it done.
Right.
They can work really fast and really nimble in a way that the giant bureaucratic companies can't do.
Yeah, and sometimes they come and just knock the incumbent out of the market entirely. And another in the tech space, another way that they come in is that they acquire venture capital and manage to build up a startup product, but they don't have the resources to figure out how to scale. So the way that a lot of these innovative little entrepreneurs figure out how to scale up is that they go off and get themselves bought by a Google or by a Microsoft or an Apple or one of those companies, and that is their way of being able to kind of skip past the logistical problems that are inherent in growing a larger customer base. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people see this as predatory. They see it as like big tech, snapping up the competition. They call it they call it a kill zone for entrepreneurship. But what they're not seeing is the flip side of that is these are the guys who are paying the innovative products to survive and to grow, and they are essentially like the R&D venture capital for the future.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms.
Yeah, and frankly, if you were to do something like what Josh Hawley wants to do and ban all of these, presumptively ban acquisitions by on Amazon, for example,
what kind of disincentives would that create?
Well, it would create a disincentive for venture capital firms or angel investors to fund these tech startups, because they, angel investors in venture capital, they want a return on their investment, and they want it within a certain amount of time. That's how they keep their funds profitable, because they know that 90-ish% of all the things they fund are actually going to fail. They need enough of them to achieve size, and so that they can cash out of those and make more money and fund new companies.
Getting to the acquisition.
And so if they don't have the exit strategy of getting acquired by large firms to lean on, really your options then for a firm becoming profitable, the time scale on that goes longer. It takes a lot longer to get to a public offering than it does to get snapped up by Amazon. Mm-hmm. And you'll start finding that fewer startups are funded and fewer of them succeed. So it's kind of people assume that these big creatures and the big 5 big tech companies are sort of consuming their competitors, and it's actually quite the opposite. This sort of ecosystem that we have right now wouldn't exist if it weren't for access to their platforms and capital.
I feel like there's a little bit of a trade-off there, though, not to go too philosophical. We obviously want to
I think you should go philosophical.
Okay, I think
that's what you do best on this show.
Well, thank you. I feel like I'm an amateur at best, but we want to encourage the innovation, and the incentives for the innovation is the ability to get acquired faster to get the payoff in a certain amount of time. But when we're always getting acquired by a few large conglomerates in the market, you don't have a plurality of many small companies. And I think when that's kind of a form of centralization where I think it diminishes the human spirit in a way. Like when you're closer to the decision making on a small company, you kind of have part of ownership. And when you get caught up in a large company, you're just kind of a cog in the machine.
Totally.
So I think there's a trade-off that we at least have to recognize. Like I don't want to disincentivize that innovation and those small startups, but I'd rather have a plurality of market competition, not only for the competition, but for the human spirit, which is, again, that's not anything you can really quantify. But
yeah, and that's why, I mean, you have companies who were refused the acquisition angle, and they'll either attempt to grow to the scale where they can get a public offering and get funded that way through stock, or they just don't have an exit strategy and they try to grow themselves and try to become a large market incumbent simply on the basis of their own ability. And those are longer odds, but if you have if that's your vision and that's what you want to do, then by all means go for it.
It becomes a matter of principle then.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, you do have it got cited in a congressional hearing that, for example, the CEO of Waze now regrets selling to Google, the former CEO, I guess, because he feels that they hampered some of its potential in some ways in the way that they integrated it into their services. But that's a choice, right? That's a risk that you take. It's the same thing with like Whole Foods selling to Amazon, and the CEO Mackey being concerned about whether they were going to keep his vision for the company intact. That's a decision at some point in time that you have to make if in terms of becoming a publicly traded company where now suddenly you have to satisfy your shareholders, or becoming acquired where now you're answering to somebody else as a boss.
There is the fewest, I heard we're at like an all-time low of either, I think, growth of new publicly traded companies, which it's a weird dynamic to be into where the stock market's going gangbuster, but there's no
new companies.
The growth is the lowest it's ever been.
That's something I've been looking into more, because obviously now we're getting outside of my area of expertise, and we're getting into financial services, and that is one of the areas of government regulation I understand the least. But the one thing I do understand is that there are a series of government regulations with respect to investment and capital that do exist that have made it harder for companies to reach IPO, and why companies now take several years longer than they used to get to the point where they can get publicly offered and succeed. Among those things are, for example, Sarbanes-Oxley, and so we're kind of getting outside of the tech sphere, but no, it's just kind of showing. I mean, like the fact that we're relying on these big five or whatever tech firms to do a lot of the the helping these small companies grow along by buying them up. The fact that we're so reliant on that is partially also a side effect of government regulations elsewhere, and it's bled into big tech.
Yeah, I mean, this whole thing reminds me of when I was working at Virgin Megastore in New York, and it was about to go out of business, and I was like desperate to keep it from going out of business because I love record stores so much, and I kept going to the managers of the store and like with all these ideas. It's like, here's things we can do to compete with the internet. Here's things we can streamline. Here's costs we can cut, and like nobody cared. Nobody was interested because this like corporate has already decided we're going out of business. We can't make like independent decisions on our own. We have to answer to the higher ups in this giant bureaucracy of a company. And it's like, if we were a startup and we had like 10 people on staff, I could have gone to the CEO and said, here's how we got to do to not go out of business, and they would have listened. But they wouldn't listen because they were a giant monopoly corporation and they just went out of business. Very frustrating for me.
It's kind of the skin in the game, right?
It's like, I have all these good ideas, you won't listen to me.
So my Star Wars theory is the reason the original Star Wars are better is because George Lucas had his whole life and livelihood on the line.
Yes.
In the newer movies, these guys get to live off everything he built. So you're like, I'm just going to throw a script together, slap Star Wars on it, make a couple $1 billion. Like, oh.
That's certainly what it felt like, yeah.
Well, I've always had a theory about art where, like, people say, well, once you get old, your art doesn't get good anymore. I don't think that's the case. I think it's once you get rich, your art is no good anymore because you're then complacent and you're not hungry for it anymore. Because if you look at, like, artists from the 19th century who were all poor, musicians, composers, painters, they all died in poverty. And their art, when they were old men, was always great. But, pop rock stars like the Rolling Stones or, movie companies like Disney, when they get old, their art gets bad. And it's not because they're old, it's because they're rich. And they don't have to worry about making money anymore. They have enough money.
That's the Mike Tyson quote. It's hard to get up and work hard when you wake up in silk boxers.
Good point. That's a great quote.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is totally true, and I think that's one of the reasons too why one of the things that I'm trying to constantly, remind, because I do interact more with right-leaning conservative offices and sort of the libertarian side of the world as well, just because that's sort of where my organization's positioned, is where I am philosophically, is just to remind them that the more important thing than just addressing some of the problems that we see with big tech now is making sure that the young scrappy guys have a chance to replace them. Mm-hmm. Like, do not do to tech what has been done to so many other industries across our economy, where they've become so entrapped in regulations and subsidies and just barriers to entry that the next Google can't get funded and displace the current Google. That's the danger.
That's what I
Good
feel
point.
like the role of government should be, is to remove the barriers to entry so anyone in their garage can be Steve Jobs and get going.
This is where you and I differ, Mike. You just said the role of government should be, and I don't agree with that.
Oh, that classical liberal versus anarchist.
Yeah. Well, this is a tension that exists. I exist in the antitrust sphere, and I have to concede to the reality that antitrust law exists, that it's going to be enforced, and that no matter what I think about whether philosophically antitrust laws ought to exist, I don't live in that world. And so I end up writing long pieces about how it would be better to direct antitrust enforcement, and how it would be more rationally constrained, and how it would be more constructively used, because that's the universe we live in. Whereas I think in an ideal world, it wouldn't be necessary, because you'd have a free market where monopoly power couldn't be exercised, because that would create opportunities.
My big issue with antitrust has always been the arbitrariness of market definition.
Yes.
Which I think is I think I've talked about this on the show before, but I took a class on antitrust economics in grad school, and it just seems to me that you decide what the market is, and then it's all based on market share. If you have too high of a market share, you're considered a monopoly or an oligopoly, and they break you up. But the market share depends on what the market definition is, and the market definition can be anything you want it to be, basically. Yeah. So it's a tool that can be very easily abused by the people in charge to punish whoever they want to punish for whatever reason.
Infamously in Europe, which of course has a much more aggressive, they regulate antitrust with an aim towards preserving competitors, not competition, and so they love to break up anything they get too big, essentially. But for example, they managed to define the market so that they could sue the crap out of I believe it was Google. It was either Google or Apple, but basically Google and Apple have the two biggest app stores. They're not the only ones, but they're the dominant ones. And they managed to define the market in a case so narrowly that they basically construed that Google and Apple's app stores didn't compete against each other.
Okay.
And so they called one a monopoly, and then fined the crap out of it for being a monopoly.
Yeah, the example I always use is Coca-Cola has a monopoly on Coca-Cola. Yeah. No one else is allowed to sell Coca-Cola besides Coca-Cola. But, if you define the market as cola, you have a couple competitors. If you define the market as soda, you have lots of competitors. If you define the market as non-alcoholic drinks, you have many more competitors. It just depends on how you define the market,
Same thing with Facebook. Everyone likes to talk about, people like Ken Buck and Josh Hawley like to call Facebook a monopoly, and it's like, well, yeah, it's a monopoly on being Facebook. There is no other Facebook that's competing with Facebook to be Facebook. But the social media time that people spend staring at these little devices is being divided between Facebook and Twitter and Clubhouse and TikTok and Snapchat and Instagram, which Facebook owns, and
almost exclusively YouTube for me. But
and YouTube and a universe of other competitors that haven't succeeded to the level where I'm able to pull up their name as Reddit is another huge one. If you define the market so narrowly that it's like just Facebook, they have a monopoly of that market, but people's time is finite, and they're competing for that time, and it's robust competition in that market.
Definitely.
Yeah, it would seem almost silly to say we need to create another identical Facebook to
right?
No, it doesn't make
I only
any
have
sense.
X amount of time to spend on the one. I don't.
That's when I always question when they say we need to break up companies. We have to break up Facebook into two companies. Well, what are the two companies going to do? They're both going to be Facebook? That doesn't make sense to me.
And then you're all going to migrate where your friends are. So eventually it's going to sort itself back out into a monopoly.
Right.
That's like the Robert
one
Nozick,
folded and the other's still going.
That's like the Robert Nozick thought experiment, where you pick your ideal distribution of wealth and you set that, and then you let everybody do what they want to do, and then in 6 months everything is back to where it started, because people are allowed to freely transact.
What do you say, Josh, to pivot a little bit though? Because before the show started, we were talking how we're at a disadvantage, and Logan hinted on it earlier, where people are very dissatisfied with the answer of just wait.
Yeah.
In the book I shared with you, Life After Google, which is written by George Gilder, who I don't know how you classify him, a philosopher, economist,
journalist, all of them both,
everything, investor. He is definitely just wait, because it's already a broken model that's outdated. The end is near. Well, I mean, what did you think of the book? He's basically arguing that blockchain is going to outplace the Google model.
Yeah, no. And to be fair, I actually have not finished the last third of the book. I got distracted, but I tend to agree with him, and I agree with him in as much as I do believe that some of these models are fairly obviously already out of date, and you can see the way the companies are behaving that acknowledge that, like the way that Google is no longer is changing the way that it uses user data, the way that Facebook is now embracing regulation. You know, you're seeing these companies look ahead and go, but I'm not so sure that it necessarily is going to be the blockchain in particular that does this. It could be, an adoption of some sort of, protocols, not platforms, environment of the internet, like what folks like Tim Berners-Lee and Mike Masnick have talked about. We don't know what that future is going to be, but the one thing that we definitely can tell is that if you give it time, and if you don't set up barriers to entry, folks are going to displace these current models. Because
there's also a generational effect, right? Because I feel like with Facebook specifically, young people are not that interested in Facebook.
Yeah. No,
and
for old people, I've been told.
Yeah, so give it 30 years, and nobody who uses Facebook is going to be alive anymore.
It's going to be full of a lot of memorial pages. Yeah. It's kind of grim, actually. You think about it. It's basically... So
you're going to have those companies that run people's social media pages
after they die.
Find a grave. All of those.
Find a grave.
Find a grave will buy it.
I mean, think about how crazy that is. I mean, Facebook has been around for, going on, almost 18 years now?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
It's about to become an adult.
They started when I was in college, so yeah, around then.
And it's interesting when you look historically at sort of innovation and creative destruction, and not just in tech markets, but elsewhere, that anywhere that there is room for creative destruction because of low barriers to entry, you tend to find that when antitrust regulators and the public are most concerned about a company being impregnable because they're a monopoly, tends to be right when they're on the cusp of going downhill. And it was definitely true. I mean, that was true for Blockbuster. Yeah. It was true for Internet Explorer, which got displaced by a host of other browsers within 5 years of the antitrust case.
Whatever happened to Netscape Navigator, you guys?
Yeah. Well, Netscape Navigator died because Internet Explorer killed it. Yeah. But Google Chrome and Safari and Mozilla and all those things have killed Internet Explorer.
This is a total tangent, but why? Apple is the biggest computer manufacturer out there these days, I would say, and phone manufacturer. Why does their web browser suck so bad? Why can't they put out a decent web browser to go with Apple computers? Safari's the worst, and I don't understand why they don't put out a good web browser.
Google
Explain
Chrome
that
is
with
the
your
best,
text
and I
and
hate
science.
using Google.
I've never understood that because I'm not an Apple guy, so I don't use those products most of the time. I've always been a PC guy, just showing my bias.
Yeah.
But I've always kind of agreed with that. I'm like, they're so good at everything else. Why does this one thing suck? I don't know.
It doesn't make it's kind of like how everybody hated Internet Explorer back when Microsoft was the dominant OS.
Yeah. No, it was terrible. And then, people were predicting it was going to be, the dominant, because they were offering it for free and forcing people to carry it on their devices, that everyone was going to be a slave to it. And we'd be dominated by this terrible, buggy, crappy browser that all programmers hated forever. And within 5 years, it was gone. Yeah. It was the same thing with, the same thing with people talking about how Google, and their search engine is going to be dominant forever because, they're forcing, devices to come preloaded with the search bar. Well, guess what? You're seeing its share of online search diminish pretty sharply.
This is sort of the argument against the bundling thing that was the whole centerpiece of that Microsoft Netscape case, antitrust case back in the day, is if the product isn't good, people are going to go elsewhere. And that's how I've gotten to where I can't use Safari for a lot of things. Safari comes default on all my machines because I use Macs, but there's websites that won't load with Safari, and so I have to do other things. I have to get Google Chrome to do it, and so.
Yeah, that's the important thing about kind of heading back to the competition policy side of things for a second. I mean, it's why the framework that we have right now, such as it is, at the very least, is tries to get the regulators and enforcers to prove that a monopolistic market concentration on a part of a company is causing harm. Mm-hmm. Microsoft Internet Explorer was offered for free and undercut Netscape Navigator, which was the dominant internet browser at the time, which had a fee attached to it, and because they offered it for free, it killed Netscape.
Yeah.
But what was the harm? Everybody got Internet Explorer for free. Microsoft did not prevent people from downloading other browsers using Internet Explorer.
Yep.
And the instant that other competitors entered the market also for free, that allowed people to do that, they did. They flocked to anything but Internet Explorer overnight, and problem solved.
Yeah, I remember the Internet Explorer days. It was a nightmare trying to use that browser. Terrible.
They still try to nudge you to it on when you buy the PC and stuff, but no one uses it.
Are you sure you don't want this to be your default?
Yeah.
We recommend it. No, I'm positive. Nothing works here.
You know, another aspect of this big tech debate that I've been thinking about a lot more lately that I think is important for conservatives actually in particular to consider is the extent to which the way that we have governed and regulated online companies sets the tone and the stage for that regulation across the world. You've got Europe, which both in terms of competition policy and in terms of how they regulate speech and how they regulate commerce is much, much more hands-on, much, much more interventionist. And there's a reason why very few of the largest tech companies in the world are based in Europe. Why the sort of platforms and protocols and the things that hold the internet together have largely been adopted from U.S. innovators, and part of it is because we've given that whole sector this amazing freedom that it had to sort of innovate and develop on its own, a freedom that very few industries in the American economy unfortunately have. And as we start sort of tightening that web, or as we start, the government starts digging its claws into emerging tech, the way that it does that is going to pass along to a lot of the rest of the world. Or, to me, what would be even worse than that is if we start, enforcing a competition policy where we're just breaking up all the big tech companies because they have too much power, then they produce lots of products that we like, and because they're big. If our economy and our companies and our entrepreneurs are not the people who are producing the next generation of big tech, whatever that's going to look like, what would it look like if instead China were setting the technology standards and for the rest of the world? What would that what would that look like? And that has implications not just for our citizens, but it has implications for sort of free expression and freedom of speech across the world.
I don't want my email address to be at wuhanmail.com.
Like in America, at least for the time being, because as long as it doesn't get regulated away, we have the ability to use things like end-to-end encryption to bypass the ability of the government to surveil what we're saying to each other. I mean, that is a lifeline for dissidents and oppressed peoples all around the world, and that largely exists because, in many cases, European and U.S. companies have created the environment for it to exist. And obviously, Chinese tech standards, they want to ban all of that kind of stuff because they want to be able to control everybody and their information all the time.
I feel like this is, I like that point that you're making there, because it goes to kind of some inner Ronald Reagan there. America, we can either be pulled in Europe's direction, or we can try to pull Europe back in our direction. And is America going to be, I feel like conservatives should be emboldened by that argument. Are we going to be the shining light upon the hill, or however Ronald Reagan described that in that famous quote, where we're going to show the rest of the world how to do it, and then embrace, in my mind, it kind of conjured up, as you're describing there, the Wild West. Are we, everyone pictures Americans as cowboy hats. Is that going to be us? Like, we're just going out into the frontier and we're going to figure this out and just kind of live free? Or are we going to control everyone's fate and be Europe and then, God forbid, be China? So I think that's a powerful argument, actually, to make.
The European road leads to China, I think, is the point you're making. Yeah.
Isn't that where did the Silk Road go again? Did that ever make?
Yeah, it went to China.
Yeah.
And then it went to jail. But,
Yeah, people tend to be pessimistic about technology. They look at innovation and they look at brand new shiny things. They look at technologies like AI, for example, and all they can think about is Terminator. And there are so many positive uses of AI that are going to come about that are going to improve the human existence so much.
They already have,
and already has. If we only focus on regulating technology like social media now because of the kind of content and moderation they do, that's bad, and so we're going to regulate them for that. If that's the only perspective from which we can approach, sort of enabling the tech ecosystem, that's going to lead to us regulating via the precautionary principle. It's going to lead to us, cutting innovation short in order to prevent possible harms and never seeing benefits that have yet to be.
Yeah,
it's a scary future.
I've always been very much a tech optimist, and I remain so, even though there's legitimate concerns for sure, but like, human progress has always been defined by technological development, and it's what has eliminated so much of global poverty, and it's what has brought about the Enlightenment, and has brought about so much improvements in our lives. And the idea that people just want to stop now, they're like, okay, we have enough, let's just stop, I think is insane. I don't know where people get this from, but the Luddites have always been around, who've been fearful and threatened by new technology. But I've always been pro, and even though there's going to be bumps along the road and we have to figure out how to use new things as a society and adapt to them, I think it's going to result in much better situations for people especially people living in the lower economic statuses. It's really going to improve their lives. So I'm totally with you on that.
I feel, too, that you mentioned here how it's not even only too much technology. They want to go back. It's this golden age fallacy where it's like, oh, the good old days. So was there ever a good old days?
No.
There's the good old days right now and tomorrow.
This is a lack of historical perspective that I think is like a major problem. When we were talking about before about how our solutions are unsatisfying, I think the reason that's true is because people don't understand history at all and they haven't read about it. And so like my solution for this would be for people to study history, because if you read about like the Victorian period, which looks really nice when you watch Victorian dramas on Hollywood movies and stuff, it looks really nice. Read about what actually went on in that period. You're not going to want to live there. Read about the 1950s and the actual, this idyllic American, like Americana 1950s. Oh, everybody was doing so well. Read about what actually happened in those periods. You're not going to think it's so great. And so it's just people don't know this stuff. I think you just have to educate people about that.
Listen, I've heard the 1950s were unbelievable.
Yeah, I know you have, but it's not true. Like I read a book about the Victorian period, and it's like there was a person whose job it was to come into your house after you were asleep and remove all the feces from your home. That was a job that everybody had because there was no plumbing.
We put that guy out of business?
Yeah, we put that guy out of business.
Terrible. Someone should have regulated that.
That's not good. You don't want that in your society. But people want to go back to those things because they don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
You never see that in like period dramas that Hollywood puts out.
Yeah, we blame so many of society's problems that need to be regulated within our own homes and communities on the innovation and the technologies as opposed to the corruption that we bring to the table.
Yeah.
Like social media is all of us and our behavior and collectively all of our foibles as well. And so many of the problems that exist with these technologies are, you can regulate them. You can choose to use the government as your solution for them, but it's not solving the root problem, because the problem with, like hate speech and disinformation on social media is us.
Yeah.
You and Mike can talk about the corruption of mankind and how we're fallen and all that kind of thing. I'll leave that to you two to talk about that.
But I agree with that to the point where it's like, we blame people for like staring at their phones all day. Oh, this is terrible. No one talks, or no one's social anymore. We lost community. I think we had that problem well before social media. It's not social media created the problem. Like, that's just us bringing our problems into modern technology.
Yeah, before that, the problem was people staring at TVs all day. Instead.
Before that was newspapers. Like, don't talk to me, son.
And then people would just like look at the stars all night and try to figure out the constellations.
Oh.
The people who came up with all these ridiculously complex pictures for like 3 stars in the sky, they must have been really bored.
Well, there's not much else to do when you and when you don't have electricity, so you can't read by night.
I think that's what it was.
But that was the golden age.
Golden age.
Innovation is awesome. Let's not stop that.
I love it.
Cheers to that, man. Finish
Indeed.
this bottle of whiskey for me, Mike. I don't want to carry it home.
Awesome. So, thank you, Josh.
Thank
Appreciate
you,
coming
Josh.
on.
Thank you.
Very nice to have you.
It's good to see you guys.
Do you guys want to go get food or something?
I'd love to go get
Sure.
food.